Okay, good morning, everyone. How's my sound? Better today? Give me thumbs up. There we go. Okay, so I just, as I mentioned earlier, I think the problem was that I had my phone on my computer, and probably the different technologies working together or working against each other. I don't really understand how these stuff work, but that's probably what it was. So I have my phone on a stand away from the computer. Okay, so first of all, it's good to see you all here. Thanks for joining us. I want to continue from where we left off last week. So we left off last week. That with a scenario, and I asked you guys to think about it, and I looked into it also more. As I mentioned, I have the Hebrew book, the Chafetz Chaim's Hebrew book, and there's commentaries on the bottom, and I looked into it a little bit to get a little better understanding of the answer. So the scenario is like this, right? You're with a bunch of friends, right? Let's say you came to the Eitz Chaim musical Havdalah, which was beautiful this past week. God willing, we'll have another Motzei Shabbos thing, Hanukkah. The next one we'll have a Hanukkah party. You're all invited. It was beautiful. We had lights outside. The weather was great. All right, we had a good time. And with social distancing, of course, right? You're schmoozing with some friends, right? And you want to say over a story somehow came up about school, right, or about something, and you're saying a story about yourself. But the story is not only about yourself. Your story is also about other people, right? Either people they know, people they don't know. And you say, oh yeah, when I was a kid, or when I was a teenager, or when I was in my 20s, when I was in my 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever it is, right? Me and Yatzel Putzel and Chaim Yankel, we did this unbelievable. It was so cool. It was so, yeah, we were a little mischief, but that's what we did. We drove a little too fast. We climbed underneath the neighbor's fence, and we whatever. I don't know, a million different things. In school, we acted a certain way, right? A lot of times, I know my kids like to hear stories of when I acted up in school. I told them that's not an excuse for you to act up in school, right? Of course, I was a model student. Right? We're not allowed to still listen to ourselves, so we'll see, right? So, so are you allowed to say a story that is including other people, but you're talking about yourself? And again, we're not talking about like you committed a crime, and something that could be perceived as something bad, or bad behavior, irresponsibility, something like that. So are you allowed to say that or not? All right. So what do you guys think? I mean, you guys read the answer probably, but what do you think you're allowed to do? And feel free to unmute yourself. I allowed you to unmute yourself or write it in the text, right? If you want to suggest a thought. What do you guys think? Are you allowed to do that? You're not allowed to do that? You're talking about yourself also. Any thoughts?
Hi, Avi. This is Jim. Good morning.
Hey, Jim.
I did not read it, so I'm not a plant. I don't know the answer, but I would.
You're real raw. Okay, go for it.
No, this is shooting from just trying to be commonsensical. Commonsensical word. I would think you could mention. I would not mention the other person, because then that might have a effect on their reputation. I think you could talk about yourself, because everything in life is a lesson. Even telling your kids, if it wasn't too bad, I wouldn't even talk about that. So that's kind of my thought.
Okay, so Jim is making a compromise. Don't mention other people's names. Today I was with a bunch of friends, right? But don't say it was Yankel Pfefferkorn and Chaim Yankel, right? But don't mention their names. And of course, we're not talking about something that's extremely bad. It's bad behavior, not teaching your kids properly. But don't mention other people. But you can talk about yourself. Okay. Any other thoughts? Anybody else? Okay. So the halacha is actually. So let's just see what they say. All right. If you have the book in front of you, on page 58. All right. So the halacha is, even though you're including yourself among the guilty parties in the story, you are not allowed to tell it if it will cast others in a negative light. So this so far looks like what Jim is saying. Don't mention other people's names. A cousin may not want others to know that their behavior irresponsible. Perhaps the story will get back to their children and reduce their parents' status in their eyes. All right, so they're giving a reason. Again, it's not it's not like they killed someone or stole or things like that. Bad behavior. All right, so it might come back other people might hear, their children and things like that. It's sort of giving other reasons, but from the wording, it sounds like what Jim is saying, that is, as long as it's not going to come back to hurt the other person, you're not mentioning the person's name, things like that, which we're going to see later on is actually one of the categories of how you're allowed to say information that won't fall under Lashon Hara by not mentioning the name of the individual. So anyways, that's a good idea, right? So then it'll be okay. But if you are mentioning the name, even though you're talking about yourself, and therefore the dilemma was, and maybe you're showing that it's not something that is so bad because you're saying it about yourself. We're talking about a healthy person, as Jim said. We're not talking about someone that wants to belittle himself in front of other people's eyes. So, when we were kids, I got kicked. Me and my buddies, we did a little mischief in school and we got kicked out or things like that, right? So it's not actually so negative, right? And you're not, when you're saying it, you're not thinking that you're saying negative, but since it could come back and hurt the other person, right? So therefore, it is considered negative. As like Jim said, it sounds like you shouldn't. It's definitely not mention the other person's name. Now, I want to talk about this a little bit because I'm sure we're going to talk about this later, and I haven't gone through the whole English book. As I mentioned, the first time going through the English book, I've gone through the Chafetz Chaim himself, right? But I just want to mention that there's another caveat over here that has to be discussed. And in the Chafetz Chaim himself, when I looked up, if you see on the bottom, it gives you where it is in the Hebrew book. Sefer Chafetz Chaim, Hilchos Lashon Hara 1:9. So it gives you the source if you ever want to go look it up. I don't think they have the English translation like it is in the book. They've broken it down into days and things like that. Right? But if you go into the book itself, in Hilchos Lashon Hara 1:9, right, so I went and I looked it up, and the Chafetz Chaim over there says, he adds a little caveat. And he says that even if you're not going to mention the name, there could be a problem of speaking Lashon Hara about yourself, right? Now you're going to say, I'm not really saying Lashon Hara. I don't think that this is something so bad, right? So of course, if you're saying, Ruvain says that he killed someone, so that's definitely Lashon Hara. That's something bad, right? But over here, again, the scenario we're in is when we're talking about something that's sort of quasi-bad, right? This quasi-bad kind of thing. It's like, it's not bad. It's not, but it could be perceived as something bad. It could be perceived as a negative thing. If it was heard in the wrong context, right, that could be taken in the wrong way. Right? So therefore, says the Chafetz Chaim that there's something called avak lashon hara, and something very important to realize. What is avak? Anybody know what the word avak means? Very good. Right, Emily here in-house, right? Yay, Emily. Right? Emily in-house over here, right, said avak lashon hara. Avak means a dust. Right? That's a literal translation of avak. We're going to see in 2 weeks Torah portion, Parshas Vayishlach, Yaakov, right? In 2 weeks Torah portion, we have that word avak again. V'yavek ish imo, right? And Jacob fought with a person, but he used the word avak. V'yavek, right? And the commentaries say the fighting created dust. Right, created dust and earth coming up, right? So it created all that sort of dust coming up. It's more than dust. It's the residue of the sand flying up. So it created haziness, right? But avak literally means, right, like the dust, the haziness, right? That comes up from sand. When you kick sand, it's like dust comes up and haziness comes up. Right, so that's what avak means. Chafetz Chaim introduces something called, and it's actually in the Be'er Ma'im Chaim, his commentary. Chafetz Chaim is just to take a second, just to realize who the Chafetz Chaim was. Right, we're not going to realize who the Chafetz Chaim is, just to get a little glimpse. Right, the Chafetz Chaim, the way he wrote his svarim, the way his books is right now. Let me show you something. This is called the Mishnah Berurah. Right, the Mishnah Berurah. Right, and I see it's backwards for you guys. I'm sorry. Right, but the Mishnah Berurah, right, is the Chafetz Chaim wrote the Mishnah Berurah also. On the top, right, you have the Shulchan Aruch, that's the code of Jewish law, and then over here you got the Mishnah Berurah. That's the Chafetz Chaim, the same author, right? The Chafetz Chaim wrote that. Chafetz Chaim also wrote the Ber Halacha, right, over here, which this is sort of giving you the pinpoint, like a Rashi on the Shulchan Aruch, right? Gives you break down the different commentaries, but in a more short form kind of way. It doesn't look too short, right? But in a more short form kind of way. The Biur Halacha takes you more in depth. He gives you the different opinions and the different thoughts of the different rabbis regarding that thing. And then on the bottom, right there, something called Shar Tzion. Right? Shar Tzion is where he gives you the where the commentaries are, and a little more why he decided something to be in the Shar Tzion and the Biur Halacha and the Mishnah Berurah. That's based on how much he felt we should follow that, or he decided to give us another opinion, but it's something to come in, and that's an interesting discussion of why he put that all in. But this is his writing. He wrote this on the Code of Jewish Law, right? The first book. In his book of Lashon Hara, it's similar, and I have it in my office. Maybe next time I'll bring it just to show. But over there, he wrote everything. On the top, he wrote the halachas of Lashon Hara and Rechilus. He breaks it up. Right? He spoke about the halachas of Lashon Hara on top. He wrote that. Then there's something called Be'er Ma'im Chaim, which is like the Mishnah Berurah, where he goes and expands, right, on what he wrote on the top. So the top sort of the pointed halacha, and on the bottom he brings down, right, different thoughts, different things, and more insight into the halacha and more things that we have to be thinking about. And over there he speaks about something called avak Lashon Hara, the dust of Lashon Hara. What does that mean? Avak Lashon Hara is not the prohibition of Lashon Hara, the biblical prohibition of Lashon Hara, but it is a sniff. It is connected to Lashon Hara in a sense of where something negative could come out. And the Be'er Ma'im Chaim over there says that even in this scenario, right, where you're talking about yourself, and therefore, since you're talking about yourself, and again, we're not talking about, you're not allowed to say Lashon Hara about yourself, and we all know this, right? The famous story with the Chavetz Chaim on the train, right? For those that don't know the story, let me just say it over very quickly. There's a famous story of the Chavetz Chaim on the train who's traveling to another city. Now, back then, they didn't have the paparazzi, right? And they didn't have, Instagram and Facebook and WhatsApp and all those social media that whenever someone goes somewhere, everybody automatically knows in a millisecond, right? Back then, whoever got the letter, or if it was in the paper, or whatever it is, that people knew, but people that not necessarily got to know that knew who was coming where. So the Chavetz Chaim was considered one of the greatest rabbis, as we mentioned, and we started this class. One of the greatest rabbis in Europe, right? In the early 1900s, the late 1800s, early 1900s. He was one of the greatest rabbis, and he would travel sometimes to different cities to speak, or he would be brought in, right? And he was traveling to a certain city. Now, the delegation, there was a delegation at the train station, right, that knew he was coming because they either invited him or the letter was sent that he was coming, but not necessarily the people on the train knew. Now, also very important that people not necessarily knew how their big rabbis looked, because, as I said, there wasn't social media. The pictures weren't everywhere, right? And if you haven't met him before or whatever it is, so not necessarily you knew how he looked. So the Chavetz Chaim was on the train, and he was sitting next to an individual who didn't know that he was sitting next to the Chavetz Chaim. The Chavetz Chaim was very humble, so he didn't say anything. And this individual was saying, "Oh, I heard the Chavetz Chaim is coming to this town. I'm so excited, this and that." And the Chavetz Chaim didn't want all this, all this to get to his head. He was very humble, right? So the story goes that he said, "I don't know if the Chavetz Chaim is so great," right? Something like that, right? I'm not so sure. And the guy slapped him in the face. How can you talk about it like that? On the Gadol Hadar, the greatest rabbi of all generations, and he slapped him. He said, "You can't talk that way," right? And if he physically slapped him or he sort of gave him words, I don't know. Again, we're talking about the early 1900s. Things were done a little differently, right? But when the train opened up and they both walked out, and the guy that was sitting next to the Chavetz Chaim and spoke to the Chavetz Chaim that way, right? That gave it to him and said, "You can't speak Lashon Hara, you can't," right? Saw that everybody was greeting this guy. He almost fainted. He fell, and he asked the Chavetz Chaim for mechila, for forgiveness, right? And the Chavetz Chaim said, "No, you taught me a very important lesson, right? You taught me a very important lesson. Thank you." He said, "You're not allowed to even say Lashon Hara about yourself, right? You're not allowed to say negative things about yourself." And the Chavetz Chaim says that when it's actually something negative, "Oh, I killed that person. Oh, I stole," something actually negative, right? So then that's regular Lashon Hara. We'll get to that later, right? But over here, regarding our scenario, and I'm stressing on this because I think this happens more often than not, Right? He said this is something called a vak lashon hara. There's a taste of lashon hara, and a vak lashon hara one should not say about himself also. Right? One should be careful not to say it about himself. Now, again, every situation is different. You're trying to teach your kids something. You're trying to have a good conversation. Show your kids that you understand where you come from. You had troubles also, right? And it's not said. You're not saying it in a derogatory way, and you're not. So then, you're trying to say a story for a lesson, right? So when we're dealing with a vak lashon hara, with a taste of lashon hara, the dust of lashon hara, the outcome of lashon hara, a lot of times it has to do with the outcome of what is being said, right? And therefore, in this scenario, right, the reason why I'm bringing this, I'm not saying in this scenario itself would be a vak lashon hara, right? But this is a good scenario to bring this idea up. Now, one has to be very careful that even when he's saying stories about himself to his children, to his friends, at Kiddush or whatever, especially guys like to brag amongst their friends, oh, I could outdo you on what happened, right? So, they like to brag. You have to be very careful that even when you're talking about yourself, even if you're not going to say something, of course, I'm not going to say lashon hara about myself, right? But even if you're saying a story that could be perceived as something negative or could be taken the wrong way, right? Even though that's not your intentions, you have to be very careful even about yourself, of course, about others, and that's what we're talking about over here. About others, that's a vak lashon hara. As Jim said, leave their names out, right? But about yourself, even about yourself, you have to be very careful, right? What's the purpose of the story and the outcome of the story? Any questions or comments on this? Okay. So let's move on. Let's move on to page 59, the growth, and then we'll move on to the next halacha. All right. So I want to start off today with the quote of the day. All right. So look at the bottom, the quote of the day, and we'll go to the other way. Who is mighty? He who makes his enemy a friend. Avester of Nassan, right? Avester of Nassan is from the times of the Mishnah. Right, it's writings of the time of the Mishnah. It is a very powerful line. Who is mighty? So we know Pirkei Avos says, and this is based on Pirkei Avos. Pirkei Avos say, "Ezo Gibor, who is strong, Hakovish is one who conquers his evil inclination, right? His power, his desires and things like that." All right, but Avos Nassan takes it a little further, pinpoints to one specific thing, and many things are mighty. But one of the things he says, right? Who is mighty, right? One who makes his enemies a friend. And if you look, I'm not going to go through the whole story, but they give a scenario, right? Names are changed, but this is a true story. A lady in Israel. Now, any of you that lived in Israel, or even if you didn't live in Israel and you're familiar with the way Israeli apartments are, if you're in seminary, there are things like that, right? Most people live in apartments, and you have one person on top of another. Right, then it's all stone, right? So you could hear a lot of times the banging from the ceiling on top of you, right? We were very lucky when we lived in an apartment. We had like this old couple on top of us. Right? So we didn't really hear anything. I feel bad for the people who are underneath us, right? but then we moved into a basement apartment of a house, and we heard the banging on top, right? So the story goes, it's very quickly, right? This couple, this lady wanted to, have she had a gan, which is a play group in her apartment, very common in Israel, very, very common. And she had a lot of noise going on, and kids and this and that. And again, not to go through the whole story, basically at the end of the day, instead of creating a fight and getting all the neighbors and to write a petition and to do everything, she constantly spoke to her and tried to create a good rapport, right? A good rapport. And thank God, at the end of the day, right, what she did was she became friends, right, and they were able to work things out. And I'm not going through the whole story, but basically the idea is, right, that it is important to work on making your enemies your friend. Now, why is this so important? Number one, because it is important. It's Ahavat Yisrael, loving your neighbor. But if your mindset is, think about it, if your mindset is to constantly try to make your enemies your friend, are you going to speak lashon hara about them? Are you going to talk negative about them? So if you want a way to try to make sure that you're not going to be the person that speaks negative about people, right? Your neighbor, a congregant, whatever it is, right? A family member, If your attitude is to try to make your enemies your friend, so then it's never going to enter your mind to start talking negative about people, because that's the contrary of making friends. You don't make friends by talking negative about them. I promise you. That much I can tell you with 100 certainty. Right? If you speak negative about people, you're not going to be their friends. Right? It's not going to happen. So if you have a mindset of trying to always make your enemies your friend, now it doesn't always work. But if you try to make your enemies your friend, if that's your mindset, your whole way of talking about people changes. You're always going to try to find the good. You're always going to try to find the common ground. You're always going to look for something positive or something neutral. You're not going to explore, right? You're not going to talk about the things that are negative. Right? So this, besides the mitzvah of Haftarecha Kamocha, besides the mitzvah of Ahavat Yisrael, which is not besides, which is extremely important, right? It is also a great tool to use to make sure that you don't speak negative about people, right? And that's why they say that every negative mitzvah has a positive, and a positive has a negative. And that's how it works. And sometimes you have to find it, right? But the commentaries say that lashon hara is a negative. Do not speak negative to your friend, right? And we spoke about that. Do not speak negative to you. It's a negative thing, right? So where's a positive mitzvah for lashon hara? So the commentary is saying, if you look at the side, right, the mitzvah of Ahavat Yisrael, the mitzvah of loving your neighbor, is possible that it will be it's a branch. It's sort of it's sort of a what's the word I'm looking for? A header, right? It's inclusive of many other things, but one of the things that it will include, right, is lashon hara, right? The negative of speaking negative. If you do the positive of Ahavat Yisrael, that will allow you to overcome the negative, right, of lashon hara. Okay. Any questions or comments? Yeah, go ahead, Emily.
No, I just think it's also kind of alludes to here that that one action doesn't make up who that person is.
Very good.
So focused on this one thing that someone did that we missed the whole entire rest of that person, and it's very like damaging to us to focus on that one negative action. Like that's not who the person is. That's just an example.
Okay, very good. Emily pointed out a very good point, and by me going quickly through the story, I missed it. Thank you, Emily. Right? That, again, if you read through it, that point is very powerful, that one of the tools that she used to be able to do that, right, is annoying. I promise you, if you've ever experienced it, it's extremely annoying. Banging on your head all the time, right? It is extremely annoying. Thank God here, most people have their own homes. Right? Some people live in apartments, right? But it is extremely annoying. So one of the tools that she used, which is a very powerful tool, is realizing that this one thing that is nudging her, this one thing that is bothering her, right? This one thing that is driving her insane, does not define the person. It does not define the person, right? And if we're able to focus on that and remember that, right, then our lives will be much better, because many people, right, have things that bother us, right, that nudge us the wrong way, right, that someone in shul, something they do, and now with COVID, oh my gosh, so the way they wear their masks and the way they come in, and doesn't mean to say that they shouldn't be called out on it, doesn't mean to say that they shouldn't be, disciplined, but to make it that you start talking negative about that person, to make it that you become crazy and sort of lose your head and become so, that doesn't define the person. Right? There's many more things to a person, right, than the character trait that you see negative about that person. Yes, right. Sometimes there are people that almost everything is negative, right? And how do we deal with that? We'll have to deal with that, right? But most people that you encounter, right, not everything. There's one or two things that really drive you crazy, and through that one or two things, you've made a whole picture, and then the whole person becomes bad, right? So, good point. Very good point, Emily. Thanks for bringing that out. That we have to realize that character trait, that thing, that scenario does not define the individual. Okay, let's move on to day 5, page 60. So what's going on over here, right? Sometimes you know someone who seems to be real solid citizen, and yet there are things about his life that might surprise people. When you are privy to such information, are you allowed to disclose it to others, right? If the subject himself is open about it and will never will even speak about it publicly. Dilemma: you attending a wedding with a bunch of old friends, right? One says something unexpected. It is hard to raise, right? It is so hard to raise kids. I don't know why that's so unexpected. Right? I can't tell you. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure who wrote this. Maybe they're like whatever. They're perfect, right? But I think everybody has I think everybody once in their lives has said that it's hard to raise kids, right? I can't tell you how many times I've explored. All right, I've exploded at them. Okay, so that maybe, you know, that, not saying that we don't all explode at our kids, right? But that's where the little negative is, right? The friend obviously isn't hiding his flaw, but may you disclose this to other people, right? You disclose this to other people. So that's the scenario. Oh my gosh, you know, the other day I just blew up on my kid. Oh my God, you know, it's like I just couldn't handle it. I just, you know, I just sent him to the room. I lost myself, right? So, anyways, someone really shouldn't say that about himself, right? It's not. Right? It's not good character trait of losing your temper, right? But that's something that happens. And listen, I'm human. It was just a terrible thing. And people talk about it like that sometimes. They don't say it as dramatic as I said it, right? That really sounds bad. But you know, the other day I couldn't handle it. I just blew up at them. I lost it, and I think I lost my feet.